Welcome to the What Bitcoin Did podcast.
Hello there from sunny Palm Springs. How are you all? Did you have a good weekend? Welcome to the What Bitcoin Did podcast, which is brought to you by the mighty Kraken, the best place to buy and sell Bitcoin. I'm your host, Peter McCormack, and today I've got an interview with Erik Voorhees from Shapeshift discussing Libertarianism. But before that, I do have a message from my show sponsors. And remember, don't skip these. It is the sponsors that allow me to travel around the world and do all these amazing interviews. Okay, so firstly, today's show is brought to you by my good friends over at BlockFi, and they have just made a couple of very cool announcements. With their interest accounts, they have dropped minimum deposits. So all interest account holder clients will no longer need to meet a minimum deposit amount in their Bitcoin, Ether, or GUSD to start earning interest. Additionally, BlockFi has removed early withdrawal penalties from the account and is now offering one free withdrawal per month for all clients. Add to this the other recent announcement, BlockFi Flex, where you can choose to receive your interest payments in the currency of your choice. With a BlockFi interest account, you can now earn interest in Bitcoin, ETH, or GUSD. And they are also offering $10 in free Bitcoin to anyone who signs up for an interest account before September the 30th, 2019. So if you're interested in trying this out, I do recommend you do your own research and then head over to blockfi.com, which is blockfi.com. Also, today's show is brought to you by the mighty Kraken, the most trusted place to buy and sell Bitcoin. And for the last few days, I've been hanging out with the Kraken team up in Wyoming and now in Palm Springs, and I've been finding about all the cool things coming up over the next few months. Really interesting things happen over in Kraken. Can't wait to tell you about it all. And you know Kraken is the place you can trust most as an exchange. They've got the best security practices out there, and they've got all the best tools for traders. They've got Kraken.com, the best place to buy and sell digital currencies. They've got margin trading with up to 5x leverage. They've got futures, they've got indices, they've got the Kraken OTC desk for large trades with private and personalized services. They've got Crypto Watch, where you can trade on multiple exchanges from a single platform. And for you advanced traders out there, they have, without doubt, the best account management service you could ask for. There really is no better place for Bitcoin traders, so join me in supporting Kraken by heading over to kraken.com, which is KRAKEN.com. Okay, so on to the show today with Erik Voorhees, the founder of Shapeshift, Bitcoin OG, and definitely one of my favorite people to interview. I think this is our third interview now, and we've been talking about making this show for a while because I've been diving down the Libertarian rabbit hole. I've done my recent shows with Safe Dean and Stefan Livera, and whilst I'm really coming round to the Libertarian principles and understanding Austrian economics, I've still got so many questions. So Libertarianism was pretty new to me when I came into Bitcoin. I've kind of always been used to the UK two-party system where you basically vote Labour or Conservative unless you're one of those weirdos who votes for the Liberal Democrats. So when people start talking to me about free markets and removing governments, it's kind of been hard for me to get my head around first, trying to imagine that because I've only ever lived with and known to have a state. So don't get me wrong, I understand these principles. I think they're kind of obvious. And I do think you should be able to do what you want with your own body. I do like the idea of removing power from the government. But would an anarchist society or even a Minica society really work? Has it really been tested? You know, who is going to regulate business? Should they be regulated? How are roads going to be built? How do we take care of healthcare? And would this society just benefit the rich over the poor? So I had loads of questions for Erik coming into this interview. He knocked them back like he's been answering these for years. He did a great job for me, and he gives me some very insightful answers. So if you do have any questions, you want to feed back to me, if you like these libertarian shows, you want me to do more of this, let me know. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com. Also, just a few notes. I've just been out in Wyoming for a few days. That was amazing, in a real libertarian, conservative environment. Did some great interviews there, so can't wait to get those out. I'm now in Palm Springs for Crypto Springs, which is going to be pretty cool. After this, I'm going to be heading out to LA for a few days. Got a bunch of interviews I'm going to be recording there. And then I'm going to be heading back to the UK, but I will be back over in October. I'm going to Ohio for a few days, going to be hanging out with the Dropbit guys. Then I'm going to be back in LA for CIS. And then I've got some other stuff on. I can't even remember. I think I'm going to be in New York for the Oslo Freedom Forum. Also, Defiance is launching in a couple of weeks. If you haven't heard about this, this is my new show, which expands beyond Bitcoin. Looking at human rights, censorship, freedom. I've done some great interviews on that. I just interviewed Brittany Kaiser, the Facebook whistleblower, which was pretty cool. And I'm also thinking of launching a Defiance event next year. So keep an eye out for that. Anyway, if you've got any questions, do reach out to me. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com. I was trying to remember if it was in that film Banking on Bitcoin. I've got this vague memory of you all being shot outside. Were you on a bike? Had you been biking? I'm trying to remember it.
No, I don't want people to remember the stupid bike scene. Yeah, they wanted like B-roll and like to take me out of the New York environment. And like, what do you like to do? So I told them I like to mountain bike when I'm in Colorado.
Right.
So we drove out to New Jersey, 30 minutes out of the city, and just got B-roll footage of me on this bike, and it was totally contrived and out of place.
It's funny I can remember that. I haven't seen the documentary for about 2 years. I watched it.
Well, that's the scene that stuck with everyone.
Yeah, but I was trying to remember because on the way, I was doing my planning and I was trying to remember when I first heard of libertarianism. I'd obviously heard of it before, but never paid any attention to it, and it was never a political option for me in the UK. It's conservative, right wing, left wing Labour, or just these strange liberals.
That's how most Americans feel too.
Well, yeah, but I certainly think there's an opportunity now for somebody.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, arguably the founding of the U.S. was basically a libertarian founding. So at that point, like, everyone was either a libertarian or a Brit. And but since then, pretty much most people in the U.S. are dirty statists, and they either vote D or R, and then that's it. So.
Well, that's the funny thing. So with discovering Bitcoin, you can discover it and just think, here's something I'm going to make some money with, or start to learn about some of the properties of it that make it interesting. And then you're thrown into this whole libertarian Austrian economics world, which I think it takes more adjustment if you're from the UK than the States, because, even at the moment, I'm processing guns. I've just done a show about guns with Ragnar, which was super interesting. And I'm definitely not where I was a year ago, where I was like, all guns are bad and they lead to mass shootings in schools. I certainly come to appreciate them both as a hunting tool, but also for defense.
I mean, neither of those are really the reason to support guns.
You're going to go back to tyrannical governments.
That is the reason.
Okay.
And people scoff at it, but if you look at the entire 20th century, governments killed tens of millions of people. Tens of millions of people. It doesn't even compare to anything else, really. And the slight reduction in likelihood of tyrannical governments killing tens of millions of people if a population is armed is worth defending the right of normal people to own firearms. That reason alone, I think, is not usually talked about. It's not really for hunting. Sure, self-defense in your home is nice, but like the real reason is to prevent that kind of tyrannical mass murder that governments commit as a matter of course every decade or two.
So, yeah, and I've just been out to Cambodia and Vietnam, and when I was in Cambodia, we didn't go to Phnom Penh because of the age of my children, but we did go into Siem Reap, into one of the museums, and, trying to teach my children about what happened there with the Khmer Rouge. And, I'm perfectly aware of plenty of places around the world now where people had weapons that maybe they could stand up against their government. And there are arguments against this, though, like, this was a law in the time of muskets. Now you've got armies. But I also see the other defense where, when the US attacked Vietnam, the Vietnamese weren't well armed, but they were able to defend themselves.
Yeah, I mean, ultimately, it's a question of do you want all people to be able to own weapons, or only government people to be able to own weapons?
It's a funny one, because even though you say that, and I couldn't see a situation changing in the US right now. I mean, I know there's some liberals who are talking about the removal of AR-15s as like one of their political agenda points.
Yeah, which is weird, because AR-15s that people can buy legally are just semi-automatic rifles.
Yeah.
So if you can't get an AR-15 semi-automatic rifle, there are many other types of semi-automatic rifles that are basically as lethal. It's the semi-automatic rifle function which is their concern. But the AR-15 looks aggressive. That's why they want to ban that gun, because of the look, which kind of demonstrates that the whole thing is really about show. Because if they were actually trying to get rid of the function of what the AR-15 does, they would be going after semi-automatic rifles.
Well, so with Ragnar, I got into the conversation and said, where's the limit? And he said, there should be no limit. You should be able to have anything the government had. So I said, well, so for example, if the government had landmines, should you be able to put landmines around your house? And he said, yep. And I said, okay, so if the government has a tank, should you be able to buy a tank? And he said, yep.
I said, okay, so should you be able to buy a nuclear weapon? So it kind of gets into this kind of, unfortunately, you always get into these weird grey areas.
It always
where you
goes
really
into a
test it.
slippery slope discussion, right?
Well, because you've got to test how far the theory goes, and I understand that why people have guns and want guns, but at the same time, I still, strangely enough, even though I agree with the point, I don't want the laws changed in the UK. I don't want us to have the same gun laws as the US. I feel like, we have our own issues. We've got a massive knife crime problem in London, but at the same time, I wouldn't want us to have the same gun laws as the US.
Yeah, it's a tricky issue. So there's utilitarian arguments about it, like whether it's more helpful for more people to have guns, and then there's like ethical and principle arguments, like if someone hasn't hurt another person, do you have a right to forcibly take away something from them or prevent them from acquiring something? And that's the argument that I find more persuasive. I think it's a very bad precedent and basis for society if you coerce peaceful people just because some people are bad and you harm good people because of that. That's a very problematic basis on which to build a good civil society.
It might be a cultural thing as well, though. You as Americans might have the PTSD of kicking us out of the country, and we might have the PTSD of being kicked out. So I want us to stay powerful and you not to have weapons, and you want to have the weapons.
Well, there's at least still in the U.S., there's still a little bit of flame of individual liberty as a principle, in not assuming that a government or a nation should be in control of everything and that individuals themselves have a certain degree of protection that they should be afforded. That was certainly a radical notion back when the U.S. was formed, and it's slipping away. And I think libertarians are really the ones who maintain still that should be the basis on which people organize.
I actually find it very interesting, almost quite exciting when I see these militias. I was talking about this Ragnar, I can't remember the actual one, but there was the militia trying to protect the farmland of a guy, and I can't remember what it was. Were they trying to tax him, or they were trying to stop him do something? And the militia stood up to him, and I thought actually that was very cool.
Yeah. I mean, I wish that kind of thing would happen more often. I wish groups of people would organize against tyranny from above. Like if that was a greater tendency, you would have less tyranny from above. And again, going back to that mass murder question, if you're just looking at body counts, the most important thing is to reduce the size of national governments, because they kill by far more than any other possible type of homicide or murder.
Locally and internationally?
Well, what do you mean locally?
So, for example, historically, we can go and look at the examples of many kind of Marxist governments who've killed a lot of people to enforce their Marxist principles or socialist principles, yet you haven't had that kind of mass murder internally in the US in such a way.
No, but that's because the US has not yet slipped fully into a socialist type state. Like there's a tendency, I think, for populations to centralize power in governments. Some people can call that socialism, but it's a tendency towards centralized power. That's why national governments tend to always grow in their power and in their regulations and in the budgets that they spend. And the only thing that really changes that or reverses it is when the government collapses or some type of horrible revolution happens. Like that pattern is seen all over the place, the birth of the US being, just one of those examples. So yeah, it has not happened within the US, and I would argue in part because there has been a decent tendency of Americans to resist centralized authority, but that's weakening, and certainly the US is becoming more and more socialist as time goes on.
But it's happened externally by the US government in other foreign lands when they've interfered with the foreign policy of other governments. Some you may say are justified, others you may say aren't.
I would say basically none of them are justified. I don't want the U.S. government to exist at all.
Well, okay, because this is a libertarian principle of either small or no government, and certainly no foreign.
Smaller the better, more decentralized the better.
Okay, so we should get into that, because this is something that's new to me, and so it's taken some time to get my head around. It is very foreign to me, the idea of libertarianism, but I definitely find it appealing, really appealing. But I do struggle in some areas. But I tell you why I find it appealing, because I've always felt trapped in politics in that I've always felt both a little bit conservative, but also felt like, not that I'm a socialist, but I certainly like a social fabric of considering others and helping others. And I've always felt lost between who I should vote for. I tend to veer more conservative. I've never actually voted for a socialist party. Well, I voted for a Green Party once, but I have voted conservative the majority of the time. I found this quote when I was preparing. You'll like this. Liberals favour government action to promote equality, whereas conservatives favour government action to promote order. Libertarians favour freedom and oppose government action to promote either equality or order.
Yeah, that's a good way to say it. That's
So-
a good way to say it.
So it gives you that other option, but why do you think it's never been a case where, or certainly not right now, that libertarian parties are having such a voice? Because there are very rational arguments to support a libertarian party.
So I've done a lot of thinking on this, and I think what it comes down to really is that most people have a hard time understanding the concept of spontaneous order. They have a hard time understanding that order can come about without being top-down controlled and created. So they see a government, building roads and picking up the trash and forming a military and all these things that they think they want. And they understand how that can happen. They don't understand how rules can happen and order can occur without a government, because it's weird and it's hard. Like decentralization it's not an element of life that people really appreciate, but it's actually all around them. When you look into nature, you see decentralized order everywhere. There's no central top-down authority that creates a tree. It emerges from various principles and patterns from the bottom up. And political life can happen in that way also, but most people are not willing to allow it to.
And the emergence of language is an example
Absolutely.
of that.
That's a great one. The emergence of mathematics or language are both very good ones. The emergence of Bitcoin, obviously, is decentralized order. Like Bitcoin has order to it. It has rules. It works in a certain way. And that didn't come from any kind of top-down thing. It's emerged from a distributed group of people. So it's actually very common. People just don't think about it in terms of like rules for society. All of a market and economy is decentralized order. It's like a company or a group of people that are building things and selling them to others. That all emerges without top-down coercion. It emerges from people's cooperation with each other, from people's mutual pursuits of profit. So order happens naturally all the time without top-down order, but people have this tendency to ignore that and want to impose it with violence, which is what government is. And that's usually where many of the problems in life come from.
Do you feel like that most people are conditioned to considering the government as their safety net? So a question I like to ask people, if they're often on Twitter, you get insulted, be called a statist, right? You're a statist.
Yeah.
You want to take away my guns, you're a statist. So I always like to throw a couple of questions back. So I like to ask if they vote.
Yeah.
More often they'll say, no, I don't vote because I'm not a statist. So then I like to ask them, if your house got robbed, burgled, would you call the police? And I think almost in every scenario they would.
Yeah, usually.
Yeah, so I think for most people who don't have these libertarian ideals and not even exposed to it, I mean, there are a vast number of people who aren't. Most of my friends will not have heard of this. Do you think they see government as a safety net because, certainly in the UK, you turn to the NHS when you're sick and you get cared for. You turn to the government for education. You turn to the government for policing. If you're out of work, you turn to the government for welfare. So they're used to having this safety net.
Yeah. So, and this is the horrible trick that happens. Government mandates that it provides a certain service. People need the service, so they use it from the government, and over time they get used to it coming from the government. Somehow they start thinking that only government can provide the service. So like healthcare is a great example. In many places, governments provide health insurance or flat out healthcare. And so people think, well, healthcare comes from the government, thus if the government wasn't doing it, we would not have healthcare. But that's very silly. Imagine if McDonald's was the only place in the world with a license to sell cheeseburgers. Everyone likes cheeseburgers. You can imagine after a couple generations if the idea of, well, McDonald's doesn't need to be around. Like we could have open competition in cheeseburgers maybe. That would scare people. They'd be like, but where would we get our burgers? They come from McDonald's. That happens in basically every service that the government provides. And most libertarians, if they're radical enough, they basically would just say anything that's important deserves to operate in a market with competition. Healthcare is extremely important, thus it should operate in an open market with competition. Education is extremely important, and thus it should operate in a market with competition, instead of having a monopoly provider from the government.
So would you say the US model for healthcare is better than the UK model?
The US model for healthcare is a total mess.
Yeah.
And it's not a market. So it's a corrupted market. It's part market, part government. It's like this weird mutant thing. It doesn't work. No one likes it. The UK system, I imagine, there's also market elements and also state elements. Most countries have this weird hybrid kind of thing. So I don't defend the U.S. system, but it's a weird combination of the two practices, and that can sometimes be worse than just a government healthcare system.
I think with the UK one, the big advantage I always hear about is that having the government negotiate pricing tends to lead to lower prices for drugs and treatments than, say, in the US. That's one of the few advantages. I see a radical difference between healthcare in both countries, traveling back and forth, just speaking to friends. I think in some ways I prefer the US system, but in other ways it scares the living crap out of me.
I mean, why shouldn't the government do the same for like cars? Should the government negotiate car prices?
It's obviously a very fair point. I think what it is with healthcare, there is a slight difference in that it can be your life.
So can cars.
There is, I think there are differences, and I think there are nuances to this. So I think if you fall between the cracks and you can't get healthcare and die, that is a big shame. I'm not defending and saying that we should have socialized healthcare, but I understand that there are people who are socialists, who want to live as a group of people organized together and believe that they want to have a socialized healthcare.
Well, not just that, but they want to force people to pay for their system.
Well, so that was one of the interesting points I was going to get to you, because I think humans naturally organize themselves. I'd always wondered if you could go full radical libertarian and have no government at all, which I think you'll struggle with 250 million people, but just say you could. And then I think around certain services or things, humans are naturally going to start to arrange themselves.
Yeah, that's the spontaneous order.
Yeah, but will it eventually evolve back to the same thing? Like, is this structure just a natural way that humans organize themselves?
It is a natural structure that humans organize themselves if they ethically accept the premise of coercion against peaceful people. So if you think it's okay to use force on someone to get them to do what you think they should do, if you believe that, and the society generally believes that, states and governments and nations will form. If you had a society of people who didn't believe that using force on a peaceful person was ethically justified, you would tend to have smaller, if any, governments.
And I agree with that, but aren't we still just animals?
Well,
selfish animals.
We are, but also we can change opinions, right? Like,
yeah, of course.
So, and I think in a libertarian society, you could have pockets of socialists who then all coerce each other into providing things by force. A libertarian would always tolerate a socialist in its society, but a socialist will never tolerate a libertarian in its society.
Yeah.
A socialist will always force the libertarian to pay for its purposes. The libertarian will never force the socialist to pay for its purposes. And that difference is really like the ethical fulcrum on which this stuff depends.
That sounds like the arguments I have with my brother. We've been arguing over Brexit recently. I'm pro-Brexit, and he's anti-Brexit. And, so because he would naturally vote for Labour and Corbyn, I always call him a Marxist to piss him off. So we get into debates, but he gets really frustrated with my point of view. And I've noticed that, for example, when I put something on Facebook occasionally, just provocative to see how my friends react, and those who are anti-Brexit tend to be more socialist and tend to be more angry about what we should do.
They want to control.
Yeah.
I mean, the whole Brexit premise is that Britain should be more in control of itself. It is basically an appeal toward decentralization of power. And anyone who doesn't want that to happen is trying to centralize power, like kind of by definition. They want to pull some of the power away from Britain to Europe. And it really comes down to whether you think it's okay to use force on people. And if you are okay with that, you'll tend to coalesce power and you'll get larger and larger governments. And most people, unfortunately, are okay with that.
Right. Okay. So one of the areas that I've found interesting, where I was discussing with Francis Poulier, and he is a fan of a Minica State, whereby the police, essentially law and order, is provided by a very limited government. So police, law and military is provided. How do you feel about that? Because like law and order is a central component of libertarianism, so that has to be enforced somehow, hopefully with consistency.
Yeah. Well, yeah. So libertarians is a big group. It ranges from anarchists to basically like people who believe in most of what the government does, but just want lower taxes. So like that whole range is kind of they might call themselves libertarians.
Where are you?
I am very sympathetic to full anarchy where there's no central state. I also think that I would much rather just reduce the government step by step and move in that direction. And I'm willing to accept the fact that that pure anarchy may not work. I think it would, but it's so different from the world we live in that I don't assume it. I just want to reduce the government, and I want to keep reducing it, and I think the world would get better and better and better. I think probably find yourself at anarchy and the world would be the best that it could be. But if it was something short of that, that's an improvement also. So I'm a little more pragmatic about it.
Yeah, and it reminds me of a tweet you sent quite a while ago. I remember you putting out one that said something like, we should strive for less government, but every year we've had more government, or something along those lines.
There's never been a year in the U.S. where the government shrank, other than the year immediately following World War II.
Because you could go full anarchy, but if you went full anarchy, it would be anarchy. I think society would collapse.
And even if you did that immediately, the adjustment would be violent and difficult and crazy. And so libertarians always get into these discussions of like anarchy or minarchy or something. I think those things kind of distract from the point that it would just be good if the government got smaller.
Okay.
And I think most people like agree with that. Like just smaller. Like let's try 1% smaller.
I think even socialists would agree with that.
Well, I don't know. If a Republican was in charge, I think a Democrat would want the government 1% smaller, but then they'd just swing back the other direction. I just want to see a government shrink. Like
so where would you start? What would be a good starting point?
Just reduce all points of the budget by 1% next year. Just start with that. Every single budget by 1%. Does anyone think that the world would fall apart?
No.
I mean, you could get rid of like 30% of the government, and it would be basically the size that it was back in like the year 2000.
But a government doesn't have to keep the budget. That's a fundamental problem with that. Like, you can reduce the budget of Shapeshift, and I can reduce.
I just mean
budget.
Spending. Whatever they spent this year, spend 1% less next year. Let's just start there.
But I think that's actually, I think that's impractical, because I think the way governments are now in competition, like everyone's of fear of having a currency crash before the other. There's radical printing of money.
They all want their currencies to crash. They're all trying to devalue their currencies.
Sorry, devalue on the international stage, but what I'm saying is they don't want a complete collapse of their currency.
Right.
And they will keep spending as and when they require it for whatever purpose. They'll just keep printing money, right? So I don't think it's practical, but I think a more practical approach would be let's change one aspect. Let's change education, or let's change policing, or let's change regulations, or let's change part of welfare. If you actually pick something and change that, I think that's practical.
Maybe. I have zero faith in the political system. Like, I'm very opposed to democracy in principle.
Okay.
And certainly a lot of people try to just vote and get one part of the government to change. And that could be like a lifetime of work and nothing gets smaller. Like, again, the whole government just gets bigger and bigger and bigger. And I don't think that any amount of like libertarian talking on the internet is going to change that phenomenon. So that's kind of fatalistic, but this is part of what got me so excited about Bitcoin, was that it was a way to take a piece of what the government was doing, which was money creation and management, and just completely sidestep the government entirely, not have to worry about voting, not have to worry about convincing any person to try it. Bitcoin was a brilliant way to just use something else and sidestep the government entirely.
So, do you believe that Bitcoin is like a stepping stone to completely changing government and structure and state?
Yeah, I mean,
right.
And this was, I've held this since I first learned about it, which is, I think that Bitcoin or some crypto or many cryptos will take over the world. People will tend to use them as their money instead of fiat, because on one can't be debased and the other can. Over time, people will tend to hold value in the thing that can't be debased. That seems obvious. And at some point, that means the government won't be able to just print money to subsidize its spending, which means it will have to reduce its spending. So it's like the single thing that could actually cause the government to spend less.
Because as Bitcoin becomes more powerful, the fiat currency becomes less powerful.
Yes. And at some point, fiat currencies will fall apart or collapse or go away. The world will transition into Bitcoin slowly or in a crisis situation. And when that happens, the government will be taxing and spending Bitcoin, but it can't print Bitcoin. So its sort of third tentacle of tyranny is reduced. It can't print, so it has to shrink. It can only grow by what it can borrow or tax.
Because it'll have budget constraints.
Yeah. Right now, it spends whatever it can borrow, tax, or print. So you get rid of print, and by definition, you've forced the government to be smaller.
Do you genuinely believe an alternative cryptocurrency outside of Bitcoin can achieve this?
Can? Yeah, sure. Bitcoin's the obvious likely choice. Bitcoin's the obvious one to put your money on, as they say. But I don't think anyone should assume that it is impossible that a different crypto surpasses Bitcoin. That would be
of
naive.
course.
Yeah.
But what I mean by that is, like, are people focusing on Bitcoin in the right way to create this opportunity? You as a libertarian see the opportunity with Bitcoin. You see what it can do to separation of money and state. Do you think people are aggressively pursuing this in the right way, or do you think...
You mean Bitcoiners? People that are in the...
I mean, I think Bitcoin and crypto people...
Well, the group is not homogeneous anymore.
No.
Like early on, nearly everyone in Bitcoin was a radical anarchist, or a radical libertarian at least. As it's grown, and rightly so, it pulls in more and more and more people of different persuasions, a lot of people who are entirely not at all libertarian, and that's good. The whole Bitcoin takes over the world by pulling 7 billion people into it, and you're not going to convince all those people to be libertarian, but it doesn't matter. If the world is using Bitcoin, governments will have to shrink, and it doesn't really matter what portion of those people were libertarians.
So does the government naturally become libertarian?
No, it just shrinks.
It just shrinks.
It just shrinks because it can't print money anymore. So I don't know that 50 years. Let's say 50 years from now, Bitcoin's taken over and it is the basic unit of money for the world. I don't think that the portion of libertarians in the world will necessarily be any higher, but governments won't be able to grow as much, and that will be kind of the most important win that Bitcoin can bring to the world.
Are there any downsides to this? Like within libertarian circles, do any of you argue like key differences
between libertarians?
Yeah,
that's all they do. They just spend their time arguing about like the differences between them.
What are the conflict points though? Like where are the
biggest one is always the like minarchist versus anarchist question, which
I'm
is
definitely minarchist.
Well, yeah, and before Bitcoin, like I was part of the Free State Project.
Yeah.
So I was around radical libertarians constantly. And they spent all their time just arguing about this point between anarchy and minarchy. And like, to me, that's like, okay, do we want to get rid of, 98% of the government or 100% of the government? I don't care. Like, let's just get rid of some of it.
Yeah, okay.
So I think libertarians really had spent too much time debating that point, and they should all realize that once we shrink the government a significant degree, then it's time to have that debate. Do we shrink it all the way to zero, or do we stop somewhere?
I've got to go to Crypto Springs later in the week, and I'm doing a panel which is 1984 versus Brave New World, dystopian futures. And prepping for that, I downloaded an interview with Aldous Huxley.
Cool.
Yeah, very cool, very cool. I've never actually read the book. I've read 1984. And he, quite interestingly in that, this is a bit of a diversion, but he's talked about two forces which encroach on freedom. One is overpopulation because of the demand on resources, therefore government has to grow to control and manage the people. And also because as populations grow, there's more social unrest, therefore you essentially need more government for that.
I disagree with both of those points, but go on.
Well, and the other one, he was like, the overcomplication through the advance of technology. Like technology allows you to create more complicated systems and more complicated structures, and therefore also encroaches on freedom.
Yeah, that last one's interesting. I guess it depends what he's defining freedom as.
Well, I mean, I think this interview was in the 50s, so it was very different technology back then and devices. I mean, he's talking about radio and TV, whereas we now have the internet and phones and everything. But let's deal with the first one, the overpopulation one.
Yeah, I think most people worry about overpopulation. They think that's a problem. I don't think it's a problem. I think the average human produces more resources than they consume. And if you hold that, then more people doesn't mean less resources. It actually means more. So
That's not all resources, because some are scarce.
Well, that's not that obvious. So take food, for example. Obviously, the world today has vastly more people than it ever has in history, and it has vastly more food than it ever has in history. Clearly something there happened, and that's because humans create more food than they consume, right? So would you grant that?
Yes, without question.
Something like water at first seems scarce, but really water is like the most plentiful resource on the planet. It's really about desalinated water, but any water can be desalinated with energy. If you spend enough energy, you can desalinate water. So it's really just a matter of cost.
Yeah.
So a society wealth enough at any level of population could just desalinate enough water to use. So water is not really a scarce resource either. It's just a question of how wealthy the population is. Most resources actually are not scarce. They're produced by humans. Like the U.S. has more lumber and more trees and more forest coverage today than it did 100 years ago, even though its population is like 6 times as high.
I never knew that.
Yeah, no, most people don't talk about that. It's because most lumber comes from lumber companies which grow trees, and they have an interest in building forests. So there's more wood today in the U.S. than there was 100 years ago, even though the population's higher.
Can they not export that to the rainforest down in Brazil?
Well, if they privatized the rainforest, I bet the rainforest would actually get a lot healthier.
Actually, that's a different problem because they're deforesting for farmland. More often grown soy for the burgers.
Yeah. And which gets you back into like government subsidies and people farming the wrong things due to those kind of bad incentives, but that's a different topic.
So I'm going to go through some of the takes I have and some of the areas that I'm confused with or not totally sure. Okay, the first thing I actually wrote was there are a lot of Bitcoiners who are libertarians who want free choice but don't seem to be completely tolerant of other people's free choice. Certainly on Twitter. There seems to be some feels like coercive behavior.
So here's where you have to define coercion, right? Because to me, coercion means you've forcefully made someone do something. Like you've threatened physical harm, or you've threatened to like steal from them or something like that. You're coercing them. So governments coerce people all the time. That's what they do. They threaten to throw you in a cage, for example, if you smoke marijuana. That's very different than someone critiquing you. That's not coercion, that's critique. I think that's a much lower level of interference. And I think it's perfectly fine. For people to critique each other is one thing, but to coerce someone, that's unethical.
Okay, that's a fair point. Another thing I was considering was, if you think about property rights, do they in some ways create a, how would I put this, like a chronological disadvantage that, you know, as the population grows, you are at a disadvantage to those who've come before you, who've created wealth and given it to their families and perhaps created companies which are monopolies. There's perhaps less land. I mean, we know there's less land. It's more expensive to buy houses now than it was previously.
There's less land, but there's more property. So here again, property is not
proportionally more expensive, though, right?
I don't know. I mean, you got to factor out inflation. Is a normal property for someone more expensive today in real terms than it was 200 years ago? I would argue no, if you include all the luxuries that the properties have. Like someone today with a house that has air conditioning, TV, internet, like all those kind of things, versus someone who had a house 100 years ago. Which one's more expensive in real terms? That would need some analysis, but I don't think it's obvious that it's more expensive.
would you agree that is perhaps a chronological disadvantage, or do you think everyone born today has as much opportunity as someone 10 years ago, 15 years ago?
Yeah, I mean, no one should assume that everything's equal in a libertarian world. Like, I think a libertarian simply acknowledges and recognizes that nothing is equal in the world. No two people are the same. No two properties are the same. No two life stories with the advantages and luck that the people got are the same. It's all different. Nothing's equal. And trying to coerce the world into equality causes more harms than it solves.
Okay.
So yeah, there are certainly disadvantages and unfairness and inequity in a libertarian world. The way to solve that is through charity and being a good person, not through using a gun to force people to do something.
Okay. How about some of the additional benefits you get from a state? So, for example, the regulations around providing access to facilities for those with disabilities. Mm-hmm. That is a big and important thing in the UK. Without having any form of discrimination for those with disabilities, you have to have ramps, etc., etc. There is no guarantee that would happen in a world without a state.
Nope.
Is that tough luck?
Sure, tough luck in one sense, but on the basis of private property, if you own property and you don't want to build a ramp on your property, you shouldn't be forced to build a ramp. Now, if you're a business and you want customers, if you think there are enough customers that might find that ramp useful, it's in your interest to build a ramp for those people. Or maybe you just do it because you want to help those people. Like, a lot of people are generous like that. And maybe some stores wouldn't have a ramp and someone in a wheelchair isn't able to get into those stores. But like, the point is it ethical to force someone to build a ramp or not? I don't think it is. I think if it's your property, you do what you want with it, as long as you're not coercing or harming someone else. It's your choice.
And so on that basis, you would have the option to refuse someone into your business based on their sexuality, their race.
That's freedom. No one should be forced to interact with someone else. And so, the example that people would frown at is like a really racist person with a bakery who doesn't want to serve, a black person, right? And everyone's like, oh, that's awful. Okay, flip it around. What about a black person who has a bakery and doesn't want to serve the racist? I think both people should have the freedom to make their own judgment. And I would not, if I knew that there was a racist baker in town, I'm not going to go buy his food because the guy's a dick.
Yeah.
Like, I'm not going to go there. And he's losing out on money because he's not serving us a portion of the population. But it should be his choice. Like, that is freedom. And if you acknowledge that people have the right to their own property, it should apply in both cases, regardless of whether someone's a jerk.
So how do you feel in a world, therefore, where someone like Twitter will censor certain comments and certain speech? Do you think that's the perfect scenario, in that there should be no censorship, yet Twitter has the right to censor in their own environment, so that's fine?
It's their property.
It's their property.
Yeah.
So they can create the rules.
Yeah.
There's no public good. There's no public service.
I think whenever you bleed private property boundaries into some conception of public good, you get more problems than you solve. So Twitter should be able to make whatever rules it wants, and any competitor should be able to create a competitor and do whatever they want with their own rules.
So it keeps coming back to almost two clear points: no coercion and a free market.
Well, yeah, the foundation is understanding private property,
yeah,
and avoiding coercion. Like, those are the two principles of what libertarianism is based on.
Next up, I talked to Erik more about libertarianism, but before that, I got a message from my amazing sponsors. So, as you know, as I mentioned, I'm going to be heading out to LA for CIS on October the 15th. I'm going to be moderating a panel. I'm also going to be hosting a fireside chat with Travis Kling. And the organisers of CIS, Joseph and Alon of GHV, have just launched a campaign to give everyone free tickets to their conference, and also give everyone who shows up $50 in Bitcoin, which is pretty cool. They are on a tear to spread mass adoption of Bitcoin and are literally paying you to get started. This is going to be huge. So head over to cis.la/WBD to find out how you can get paid in Bitcoin to hang out with me at CIS in LA. Also, today's show is brought to you by Dropbit. And yet, still waiting to tell you about these amazing updates. It's going to be very, very soon. There's 2 amazing, really cool updates coming to the wallet. I'm also going to be out in Ohio in October, hanging out with them. We've got a cool event coming up, so if any of you are out in Ohio and you want to hang out, then get in touch. You know how much I love Dropbit. It is without doubt the best mobile app I've used for Bitcoin. I use it all the time now. Every time I travel, I load up my wallet with sats. And even the other day, I got a waitress in a steak restaurant in Wyoming to download the Dropbit wallet. I sent her $50 in Bitcoin, and we also gave her a copy of Save Dina Moose's The Bitcoin Standard. So we created a new Bitcoiner there with Dropbit. But it's awesome. And if you haven't downloaded it, you're definitely missing out. They crush innovation. They've got the standard features of using a QR code or pasting an address, but with Dropbit, you can also text Bitcoin, you can tweet Bitcoin. It is like a Venmo for Bitcoin. So, if you haven't checked it out, it is available for the iPhone and Android. Just head over to dropbit.app, which is DROPBIT.app. And lastly, but definitely not least, today's show is brought to you by my new sponsor, MyBookie. And at the end of a hard week, when it gets down to Sunday, it's great to sit down, take some time off and watch some football. I've become a huge fan of the NFL. I'm a massive fan of the LA Rams. Nearly did it last year. I think this year might be our year. And there's no better way to make a game more exciting than have a bet. So do the smart thing and head over to mybookie.ag, as no one gives you more ways to win than they do. I wouldn't recommend them if it wasn't a service I would use. And do you know why I love them? They accept Bitcoin. How cool is that? If you're the kind of person who likes to bet a little and win a lot, then you can try a parlay. If all your picks come through, you'll multiply your winnings. And no matter how you bet, the NFL season is the best time of year to take a bet. So join now and MyBookie will double your first deposit. Just use the promo code WBitcoin to activate the offer and head over to mybookie.ag, which is mybookie.ag.
Is this all kind of utopian? Has it really been tested? Do libertarians discuss if this was ever to be achieved, what the potential downsides are, like almost like a risk analysis?
I mean, you can never have like perfect scientific experiments on this stuff, which makes it hard. No one should think, and certainly no libertarian should advocate, that a free society is a perfect society. A libertarian society will have all sorts of problems. It won't be perfect. It won't be a utopia. It might have problems that a statist society doesn't have. But I think on net, it will tend to be better, and you would be respecting the sovereignty of an individual. And I think as a foundation of society, that is a much stronger basis on which to build something. The places where tests have occurred or seem to occur, things like North Korea and South Korea, like one clearly more centrally controlled, one clearly more free. Both were similar in their demographics and their people and their culture before the split. You know, China versus Hong Kong, like these kind of real world examples.
But this communism versus capitalism rather than...
It's centralized power versus less centralized power. And this is something that I think people that get into libertarianism start to see, is that normal people see the world in like this left-right worldview, which I don't think makes very much sense. I think a better way to see it is in how much coercive power or how much centralization you have. Both Republicans and Democrats in the U.S. are high up on the centralized power and coercion scale versus a libertarian who is much further down. So on that scale, a left-right scale, but an up-down scale of centralization of power, China is obviously much higher up than Hong Kong. So,
is it not just an ideal world for a rich person? It seems to libertarianism seems to suit the wealthy over the poor.
Why do you think that?
Because I think, in a similar way to the Bitcoin utopia, seems to suit those who discovered it earlier more than those who are coming in late, because there are certain advantages.
How many poor minorities are in prison for life because of drug offenses?
It's a great example. And
how many poor minorities are addicted to welfare?
But I'm thinking more, there has, especially we saw in Brazil, the rise of political parties who support workers, workers' parties who support...
Yeah, I don't know what that means, workers.
Am I a working class.
What
it's
is
the working class. I guess
that's like one of those weaselly terms.
I think certain people will associate it. It tends to be those who are, I guess, when you say working class, like lower earning factory workers.
Okay.
And, I think historically these groups of people have grouped together, whether it's unions or political parties, to fight for rights for them.
Yes, I think that's a problem.
You think it's a problem?
I think groups fighting for rights for their group is a problem. Groups shouldn't have rights. There should basically be one right, which is to be left alone if you're not hurting other people. That's really the only right that humans have.
Okay.
It should be.
Okay. How about the argument that a truly free market is terrible for the environment because there is, without regulation, a factory can easily pollute the local lake without any fear of reprisal?
So
And
So fair.
This one I really
fair
struggled
concern.
with this
Yeah,
one.
fair concern. And I don't want to paint a picture here that a libertarian society has no environmental problems. It would. It's a question of private property and contract law, generally. So if you're polluting a lake, you're doing it maybe because the lake is not owned. It's just public. If someone owns the lake, you can't pollute their lake. Generally, if areas are owned by private parties or consortiums of people, pollution is actually a contract violation and would be something that courts should settle. You don't have the right to damage other people's property. Now, land is easier to handle in that way than water. Water is easier to handle in that way than air. Like air is an interesting question. Should someone have the ability to pollute into the air? I think that's a fair point of debate, and I don't think any libertarians have great solutions there, but I don't think states have great solutions there either. I think that in a world without government, markets would tend to advance faster and there would be more wealth, and wealthy people have the luxury of actually appreciating their environment. You see this when countries rise through the Industrial Revolution. When you're emerging from poverty, you do not care about the environment and you will pollute because you're just trying to feed your family. When you become wealthier, you start to appreciate nature and the environment around you, and it's the wealthy countries that pay more attention to their environment. I think for example, automobiles would have moved faster through the internal combustion engine toward the Tesla-type world of electric cars when you don't have governments involved regulating everything. I think that you tend to move through those bad phases to better phases faster. So it doesn't mean that there aren't environmental problems. It just means that they are dealt with in a decentralized market fashion versus a centralized government fashion.
What about the establishment of nuclear power factories? Should that be regulated? Is it the downside of not regulating nuclear power, the potential that a town goes up in a puff of nuclear smoke and the free market can't fix that?
Well, nuclear reactors are extremely safe, first of all. I think a world with more nuclear reactors would be much less polluted than one that currently powers by coal and oil and natural gas. So if a libertarian world meant more nuclear reactors, the environmental problem, I think, would be significantly less. Now, the risk of an environmental disaster when there's a nuclear explosion is obviously a huge one. Nobody has more of a incentive to make their property secure than the owner of a nuclear power plant. Like, the capital investment to build such a thing is massive. So there are all the incentives to make it safe are there. It doesn't mean that there would never be incidents, but again, what are we comparing this to? Like, the incidents that have happened to nuclear reactors, I think, are few and far between. And I think
but devastating when they have happened.
Yeah. I mean, devastating in certain ways, not nearly as devastating as much of the other things governments have done. So it depends on what you're comparing it to.
Well, another area is also building regulations. So, I mean, I haven't done the actual research, but more often than not, one of my favorite artists is Ai Weiwei. There was a certain area actually where there was an earthquake, and because of the lack of following building regulations, or lack of building regulations, more of the buildings collapsed. He created artwork out of this. Do you not think certain things, that regulations are important to protect the safety of others?
Most of that stuff, if not all of it, is accomplished by markets. So in the case of property and standards for safety, insurance comes into play. If you build a property in a place where there are earthquakes, you want insurance, right? an insurer has an incentive to want you to have certain building standards. Your insurance rates will be higher if you don't have those standards. So there are natural mechanisms by which people will build safer homes where they should be safer without a government involved.
You've debated this a lot, haven't you?
I mean, yeah, all these topics always come up. I'm waiting for the roads question.
Well, so that was funny because I wasn't going to bring up the roads question, but that actually came up during a Twitter debate. But I was more actually interested in, when I was thinking about that, I'm actually more interested in the railway. Because I think practically the logistics of trying to build a railway, well, it's probably the same for roads, by coordinating all the different private landowners, it seems like that would be something very difficult.
It might be difficult, but I think markets can solve difficult things. I mean, there is nothing more complex than some of the things that markets already deliver. I mean, imagine a world where there were no roads and no government. What would happen? Like if all the roads just vanished and there were no government, and for some reason everyone didn't want a government.
If I was your neighbor, I'd build a road to you.
Well, people would start talking. They'd be like, well, what the hell are we going to do? We got to solve this problem. We need to move around, and like, who owns this land and how should we handle this? And people will figure it out. You can figure it out without coercion. The roads might look different. They might be built in different places. Maybe there'd be more or less roads. The world wouldn't look the same. But it's not like the world wouldn't have roads. And indeed, much of the early history of American road building, it was actually private roads that got built. So it's very silly to think that like only through coercion can you build roads. I mean, I think, frankly, without governments, we wouldn't need roads anymore. We'd probably already be in flying cars.
Okay,
And I'm half joking about that. But
well, maybe you might be right. So okay, well, no, certainly someone will have built something drone-based kind of flying car.
Well, certainly the biggest impediment to drone technology right now is government regulation.
Okay, so I think the only error I've got you is that it's open for debate is pollution of the air.
A contentious
point.
Same with water. Those are tricky issues.
Are there any other issues that you find tricky that you struggle with?
Yeah. So I personally I think abortion should be legal, but
doesn't that fall the non-aggression principle?
Well, this is why I think it's a fair question, and I don't think libertarians shouldn't agree on this. This is a point where the principle, which usually is clear, is not clear. So generally, libertarians believe that you have property over your body and no one else does.
Yeah, there's clashing principles here.
Yeah, exactly. Right.
Yeah.
So obviously, a 10-year-old, it's very clear that their body is theirs, and that's not contentious. A woman who isn't pregnant, that's not contentious. But where from the woman who's not pregnant to a new child being born does the body essence turn into the child, right? So like the day after an egg is fertilized, is that a child deserving private protection or private property protection? That seems silly, but I don't have a better answer of when it should be. You know, the birth of the child is a certain point at which you could make an argument. The heartbeat, it is debatable, and I think it's a difficult issue. So even though I think abortion should generally be legal, I can totally sympathize with people who think that it's murder.
There's seems to be a kind of general agreement, because if you are anti-abortion, you kind of have to, or if you're going to regulate it, sometimes you, depending on whether you make it legal or not illegal, or illegal at certain stages, I think it's about 24 weeks. It tends to be around that kind of like age where babies have been born premature but have survived. They tend to like have that as a starting point. I'm in this weird place where I would say I'm pro-life, but I don't feel like I want to ever. I don't think I've ever said that publicly, but I don't think I would ever want to enforce it on somebody.
And I think that's a fair position to say. I'm pro-life, but I wouldn't impose that on someone else. I think that's really fair. That is the principle of libertarianism, is to respect and tolerate other people's view, and certainly. A woman and her family are much more appropriate to judge those things than any kind of outside party.
Yeah, I find abortion very sad, though. So I got a girl pregnant at university, and she had an abortion without telling me. She told me a year later.
Yeah.
And that was kind of devastating at the time, just to find that out, because always in the back of my mind, I'm like, I mean, right now, I'd have a 22-year-old, which would be fucking crazy, and it does cross my mind occasionally. But I find it a very difficult subject. Again, it's very emotional.
Yeah, as it should be. Yeah, I mean, it's a tricky one, and I think people that automatically assume there's a right answer on it, I think that's unfair. I think there can be areas in life that are gray and difficult.
What about the death penalty?
Yeah, so on an ethical basis, if I knew that someone did something like murdering some children, something horrible, would I have any problem with them being killed? No. If I knew that they were guilty of it. The main problem with the death penalty is that I don't trust the government to make those judgments. So I have no problem with people who have killed others being killed. I think that's fair. I think they've violated the right of others, and they don't deserve this reciprocal right themselves. At the same time, I don't trust the government in its current form and the current court system to assess that correctly. So that's a tricky one.
Another strange one I've got listed here is that with libertarianism, it's about the freedom of choice to do what you want without imposing yourself on others or causing harm to others. And I totally and 100% support free choice with drugs. But is there an argument with the free choice with drugs? You can't. So, for example, if parents can cause harm to their children just by being drug addicts.
Well, you have to define harm. Like, are they beating their children, or they're just a bad role model?
Neglecting their children?
I think, so that's a difficult question. At some point, the neglect and the abuse of the child should be the crime, not the drugs. So that should be a clear point. So any person should be able to do all the heroin that they want. If they are abusing a child, it doesn't matter if they're on heroin or not. The abuse is what's wrong. So I wouldn't regulate drugs just because abuse of children is wrong. You should regulate the abuse of the children.
Of course, but I support free choice, but you so often see or hear stories of children being neglected because the parents are high on drugs. And also, I was watching a Louis Theroux documentary where they were going around treating overdoses. If we have the free choice to take as much heroin as we want, there is going to be bodies left everywhere. Who deals with the bodies? You are imposing
bodies
yourself.
Everywhere is probably a exaggeration.
But you are imposing yourself on people having to clear up your mess.
Yeah, I don't think that rises to the level of banning something just because some people will abuse it and then their dead body is an inconvenience for someone to figure out. Sure.
And so anyone should be able to create any synthetic drug they want to sell to anyone, and anyone else should be able to take that drug if they want whatever.
Yes. Now, an important
could be some
clarifier
fun, crazy
here
world, though.
Is that it is. I do not think it's ethically okay to lie about what that is, what the thing is. Right? If you tell someone that something is made of a certain thing and then you sell it to them and it's poison or whatever and they die, that should clearly be illegal. I mean, that falls under fraud. Frankly. Yeah. Fraud should be illegal.
So the crimes, because I remember it is murder, rape, fraud, and theft.
Yeah, and there's maybe some other few, but those are real crimes. Right. And if all the government did was prosecute that, there would be no libertarian movement because that would be reasonable. The problem is that is like 1% of what the government does, but it's like 80% of what people think the government does.
Okay. It's very hard to argue against most of this rationally because all the points you make are entirely rational and they make sense. I still struggle to see practically how it would work, but then I'm with you on the goal is small,
just smaller
bite-sized chunks.
Yeah.
Again, I'm just going to go back to an earlier question. Why do you think libertarianism has struggled, therefore, to grow and gain adoption? Because it feels like it's just better, fairer way of allowing people to live.
I mean, I certainly think it is, but it comes down to people having a belief that it's okay to use force on others, or frankly, not realizing that they're using force. Like, a lot of people that want to advocate, making marijuana illegal, they think they're doing good for society. They don't really realize that all they're advocating is to use force on people and throw them in cages for what is actually a peaceful act.
Yeah.
They don't think about it in those terms. I don't know how to get them to think about it in those terms.
I think marijuana is a great example, actually, because of how it's been professionalized since it's been legalized.
Oh, yeah.
I mean,
we're in Denver right now, and
yeah.
I can tell the audience that society here has not collapsed. You know, I knew this city before it was legal, and I know it after. Everything's fine. And now you can go into a store. There are people who can show you all these different packages of marijuana. They have different like THC contents. You can know exactly what you're getting. And you walk in, you talk to someone, you get exactly what you wanted, and then you leave. And like, it's just so much more civilized. So much more civilized than the whole black market kind of situation that's happening in illegal drugs. Every drug should be like that.
That's why. Last time I was here, I was in Boulder and I went to Brooks' store.
Mm-hmm.
So that was my first experience of going to buy, and it was great because I don't really like weed that much, but for the sake of making a show, I was gonna buy
For science. Yeah.
For science, and I did, and what ended up happening is the only thing that I get a little bit of anxiety sometimes. So the person behind the till was like, "Well, you don't want that, you want this," and and I try to remember the experience as a kid trying to buy weed. It would be like, meet us in the Sainsbury's car park. I'll be there in half an hour.
You get a baggie.
Well, no, you'd wait half an hour and they still wouldn't be there. It's going to be 15 minutes. Going to be 15 minutes, and then an hour later, you get your little bag and.
Yeah, there's no discussion of like which product is better for a certain person. It's just so obviously better. And to have people thrown in prison because they chose something with their own body is absolutely absurd. I'm quite sure that society 50 years from now will look back on this practice as something completely horrible that used to happen.
So they could do it with cocaine. Well, actually, we kind of had it proven with the Silk Road.
Yeah,
I mean, back when
absolutely
in my depths of my cocaine addiction, I was buying on the Silk Road, and it was a much better experience. Firstly, because of the ratings,
Mm-hmm.
which was brilliant,
Mm-hmm.
and secondly, the other really useful thing was the forums.
Mm-hmm.
So at a time when I knew I was doing too much and it was becoming a problem, like a real problem, that's where I went for help.
You had
and
a place to talk.
Yeah, I had a place to talk, had advice. Like I was having this like weird thing where my chest was feeling hot, so I was, they were talking about the potential risks and blah blah blah. But that was actually very helpful. And when I was doing the show with Lynn Ulbrich, I ended up going and interviewing this lady Charlotte Walsh because she was quoted in an article from the Drug Policy Alliance where they were saying undoubtedly the Silk Road led to harm reduction and less violence.
Yeah, obviously.
Why does the government not get this though? I mean, like,
there's lots of reasons. There's vested interests in the whole, prison industrial complex. Like that's obviously part of it.
Because the Prison Guards Association have a mass lobby
and
group.
the police who want their like if they can't enforce drug laws, then there are less laws to enforce, which means the police force needed is smaller, and their budgets should be smaller. But
the police force is already overstretched.
Sure, but any given level, a police force always wants more money, and so a world with more laws is a world in which a police force gets more and more and more money. So there's an entrenched interest there. But the real reason is just that a lot of people aren't willing to publicly express political support for getting rid of these stupid laws. Fortunately, it's slowly changing. It's like the one area of American life that's actually getting freer.
Yeah.
So that's great.
47 states now legal or decriminalized, is that correct? Something like that?
Or decriminalized, maybe?
Yeah, decriminalized or legal, I think.
But the trend is so obvious.
And as I believe it, I don't know which states, but certainly magic mushrooms are now either being decriminalized.
I think here in Colorado they are decriminalized.
Yeah.
Yeah.
MDMA is being used to treat PTSD.
Yeah. Yeah. There's a lot of bright lights in that regard. So society is not totally crazy. Like sometimes it does the right thing. And in the long arc of human history, the tendency is obviously toward human liberty. But it goes through these cycles and a lot of noise in any given lifespan.
Why do you think it's happened with cannabis though? Like, interesting.
I mean, most people have smoked weed.
Yeah.
So it's not an alien thing to most people.
Yeah.
I think popular culture helped normalize it. Before weed was legal in a lot of states, there were lots of movies where weed just wasn't that scary. It was just some people would hang out and smoke some weed and laugh and eat some cookies. It's like, how can you And that's pretty accurate. You know,
Yeah.
how long does society want to keep spending money throwing those people in jail when they're just eating cookies on their damn couch? So some of that I think was there.
Presidents having smoked weed.
Yeah, everyone.
Clinton.
But also it was a lot of work from dedicated groups that have been working on this for decades. So it's not like it just happened. It came after, you know, people spent their lifetime working on it.
Do you think one of the biggest changes that's helped also is, you know, with the internet, we have more information. Information is power.
Mm-hmm.
You know, I was listening to I think it was on Joe Rogan, had Bill Burr on there, and he was saying, you know, because he's a drummer, he was saying now, because of the internet, kids now are better drummers because there's so much more information out there that they can follow and learn, learn to drum. Do you think there's so much more information out there now because of the internet that people are starting to, without even speaking to each other, but collectively start to see a different world and a better world? Because
In some ways. In
Yeah.
others, it's getting much worse because of the internet.
in what ways?
I mean, obviously, political discourse generally
Yes.
is much worse now. It's more polarized. People identify with their group much more strongly and tend to vilify the other group much more strongly on the internet.
Quite interestingly, actually, Aldous Huxley talked about that as well. He said the future is where the advertisers paint the picture of a politician to sell votes and not for what they actually are as a person. Have you watched The Loudest Voice?
No,
About Fox News, about Roger Ailes?
I have not.
That is fascinating.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I didn't know the story of him.
Is it on
until I saw
Netflix?
No, it might be like a HBO thing because we had it on Sky. I didn't even know the story. It was just because it was Russell Crowe. I watched it, and it was a very interesting show because what happened was when they were launching Fox News, he obviously took on the role of whatever, head of content or whatever he was, or director. And the first meeting when they were trying to talk about the content policy, you know, they were talking about potentially being kind of like centrist, etc. And he said no. He said there's no. If we're centrist, we fight with everyone for the same people. If we go right wing conservative, then we can get 60% of the population because they would just listen to us. So that's what happened.
Mm-hmm.
And I was watching that and then seeing where we are today, and I was just feeling it is the media has absolutely destroyed political discourse.
Yeah. But not just the media, people themselves through, you know, their Facebook posts and like the non-face-to-face superficial discussion has made it really bad. The media
Yeah.
has certainly amplified it. But when the government is involved in more and more of people's lives, then of course the antagonism between people will get higher. This is another reason why government should just be involved in less things, because there'd be less reasons to hate someone of a different party
Because you don't have
if
to
the
argue
party
about it.
didn't have as much control over your life. You know, if the federal government was much smaller, someone who hates Trump today would have less reason to hate Trump. He would be a less powerful person. I think that would be good for the world. At the same time, I think it'd be a better world if Obama had less power. But you can't have one without the other. And the problem is that each side wants more power for themselves. And so when they're in power, they get more of it. And then the other side gets in power and they get more of it. And ultimately, the government grows and grows and grows.
You know, I was about to ask you because, I mean, I think Trump's insane and we have another election coming. He's probably going to win. But equally, I wasn't a huge fan of Obama, and I certainly wasn't a fan of Hillary and nor Bernie. I was thinking, well, how do things get better? But again, you're just going to come back to the same point: less government. Everything comes back to less government.
Yeah, I mean, how can you look at democracy well when in the U.S. democracy yields its two prime candidates, the cream of the crop that the democratic process has formed, and it's Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump. Those are the pinnacles of conservative and liberal ideology, and like that's total nonsense. They're both horrible people. I can't imagine why people would support a system that yields that, and yet they do.
Yeah, I was interviewing Stefan Avera. I can't remember what he said, but he was like, did he say democracy is soft socialism? Does that sound about right?
I haven't heard that.
Yeah, but he's an Austrian economist. All right, well, look, we shouldn't finish without just finding out how things going. How's everything here at Shapeshift going? Because you've left me with loads to think about libertarianism, and I'm going to have to go away and try to wrap my head around this. But how's everything going here?
Yeah, things are good. We're just, we had to do this huge pivot from our post-KYC world into the new platform. And
Another attack on freedom.
yeah, don't get me started on that.
Hey, what was it like when Snowden talked about that? Like,
Oh, that was surreal.
have you ever spoken to him?
No.
So that was just random because I was stood next to you when that happened.
Yeah, it was right after my panel, and I
Yeah.
was sitting in the back, and Snowden gets up there, and I was all excited to see him. He's always been a hero of mine, but I've never talked to him. And he, in this first minute, he brings
Yeah.
up Shapeshift and me personally. He said
Yeah.
my name, and I was just, fangirling out there. It was cool. I think he was using Shapeshift as an example of that government will try to impose its coercion through any medium it can, right? And so any centralized company is going to be somewhat vulnerable to that. And yeah, it was obviously I would have rather come up in a different context, but he's right.
You'll take it.
We were forced to do that, and it sucks and it's wrong. And I think if it can be a story for people to see that's good. So yeah, it was definitely an honor. And so his book recently came out.
Yes, I
Apparently
saw.
the CIA or DOJ is suing him and trying to get the book stopped.
How are they going to do that? He's in Russia.
I don't know, but I figured they might try to get like Amazon to stop selling it. So as soon as I saw that headline, I went on Amazon and I bought 10 copies. And I think the Streisand effect is going to be in full force on that one.
I mean, did you see his tweet? Bitcoin has solves this or something. He actually tweeted out Bitcoin in reference to the book.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, like the government can prevent Amazon from selling the book and Visa from processing transactions, but they can't stop Bitcoin. And This
Exactly.
is an echo of the whole WikiLeaks thing that happened back in 2011.
If they banned it, it would actually be exciting. I
Yeah.
think it would be, you would see, I mean, it's too late anyway. The book's out now.
It's out.
The information isn't there.
Yeah.
What is the point?
Yeah, I mean, all they've done is drum up a whole bunch more attention to Snowden.
Yeah.
I mean, that guy is such a deserved hero for what he did, and that he could have just done what he did and then gone into hiding, and he would have been a hero.
Not everyone thinks that, though. Patriots don't.
Well, got to define patriot. I consider myself a patriot. I think
Okay. Status patriot.
Yeah, people who advocate for the government.
Yeah.
Right, status by definition. I consider myself a patriot. I love America. I love the people. I love the culture in some ways. And I think what Snowden did was incredibly patriotic, a huge risk to himself
Yeah.
to basically show how the U.S. government was violating its own rules.
A lot of
and
people call him
spying on
a traitor,
people.
though.
I mean, it's bullshit. It's bullshit. He is a traitor to the U.S. government. He should be a hero to the U.S. people. And we've gotten to a point now where the U.S. government is at odds with the people and is adverse to the people. But this is always like the inevitable outcome of centralization of power. And the only way it solves itself is when the U.S. government will go bankrupt through a bond market collapse, which will happen in our lifetime, probably relatively soon. I don't know what will emerge on the other side of it, but no one's voting the government to get smaller, so it keeps getting bigger.
Anyway, sorry I interrupted then. So, anyway, how are things going here?
Yeah, good. I mean, it's so, yeah, Shapeshift, the new platform, is basically a way to interact with your crypto in a self-custodied way. This has been a personal mission of mine to move people away from these custodians, all the exchanges and wallets that are holding people's funds. I think there should be some custodians, but I think too many people use them. And so we wanted to build a great UX that people could use and maintain control over their keys. That's the whole point of what we're doing. So we are, trying to rebuild after crypto winter and after the whole KYC thing, and it's been a huge struggle. But those who've been using the platform really love it, so the early feedback's been good. And I'm just glad to be building a project as part of this crypto movement, because getting back to libertarianism, the whole point of this movement is to help advance liberty, in my opinion. And so being able to build something toward that end is really fulfilling.
And anything out there particularly exciting you?
Particularly exciting me. I think the DeFi stuff is really cool. And I know the maximalists are hating on it because it's built on Ethereum.
Yeah, I know.
They'd be loving it if it was built on Bitcoin.
They're going to give me shit just for having you on again.
Yeah, I know.
He's a shitcoiner.
I know. If I only liked Bitcoin, they'd like me. But I
Yeah,
don't,
yeah.
so they hate me.
Yeah.
Whatever. The DeFi stuff's awesome. It has lots of risks. Like
Yeah.
it is all alpha and beta software. Some of it's going to blow up spectacularly. There will be some DAO-like incidents. Fine. That is pioneering finance when you're building out on the edge of technologies. So DeFi having problems and risks does not mean it's bad. But the ability of capital markets to form without any central party, where anyone in the world can be lending money to other people in the world, and like as that capital market forms, that's going to be completely transformative to the whole world. people shouldn't dismiss it. They're like, oh, you can make, like 7% on your DAI deposits right now. Like, that's cute. They don't realize that over time, the ability for people with capital to lend it to people without it, without any intermediaries, changes the entire financial system. In the same way that Bitcoin changes it from a money perspective, this DeFi stuff is super powerful. And it's a shame that a lot of the Bitcoiners are just dismissing it because it's built on Ethereum.
Yeah, I'm not going to get into that now.
Yeah.
But I tell you what I'm excited about is that I think we're very close to that whole crossing the chasm now.
We're getting there.
If you look, so Snowden tweeting about Bitcoin in reference to his book, a lot of people have gone to see that. We've got a Premier League football club, Watford, who've got the Bitcoin logo on their shirt.
Yep.
We've got Russell Okung talking about it. We've got...
There's an NBA player saying that he's
Spencer.
trying to tokenize his contract,
Yeah.
so that people can invest in his future payouts, in a token.
We've got countries wanting to do their own currencies, which I don't hugely support. But I am seeing just like Bitcoin seems to be just right on the edge of like infiltrating pop culture in a big way. And once it becomes, I think becomes cool. It's got to become cool.
Yeah, there hasn't been anyone in at least a year, whenever they've asked like, oh, what do you do? And I mentioned Bitcoin. No one says, what is that? Like, we are well past that. Most people, at least in the US, have heard of it. That's incredible.
I was at the Human Rights Foundation Freedom Forum in Oslo, and I asked a room, has anyone not heard of Bitcoin? And not a single hand went up.
Yeah.
And I didn't expect many, but I thought one or two might.
Well, there would have been one or two, but they would have been embarrassed. And that's telling, because it's now embarrassing not to know about it. Whereas before, it was embarrassing to talk about Bitcoin. Now it's embarrassing if someone doesn't know about it.
Well, I can't remember the last time I've said to somebody, what do you do? I've got a Bitcoin podcast. Or what's Bitcoin? Like everyone's heard of it. They still throw some of the FUD questions at you, but I feel like we're there. I feel like we're just about to cross the chasm.
Well, just Bitcoin will keep growing sort of in this like oscillating growth path until the next financial crisis. And when that happens, it's going to be crazy. The blockchains aren't ready to scale to handle that yet, but that's okay. There is an alternative now. And the amount of attention that alternatives to the fiat financial system will get at the next crisis, if it's a serious financial crisis, will be immense. And really, I think it's incumbent on the industry to realize that we're in a race against time to get things built so that we're in the best position possible to act as that lifeboat when things fall apart. And that will be when the chasm's crossed. That will be when people make the habitual shift from what they're using today in the fiat world to the crypto world. And there's going to be a whole bunch of misery that comes out of that. So I don't want to like glamorize the collapse, but we didn't cause that collapse. The fiat system did, and I think we're building the solution. So I'm looking forward to helping people after we get rid of that stuff.
Wow, I think it's pretty exciting. So, okay, I think we're about at our deadline. Do you want to just tell people how to find out more about what you guys are up to and find out more about you?
Yeah, I'm always on Twitter at Erik Voorhees. And you can try out Shapeshift with a Trezor or KeepKey right now without any account at beta.shapeshift.com. Give it a try. I think you'll find it's a really great way to interact and store your crypto and maintain control of your keys. So try it out there, and glad to chat.
Thanks for coming on again. That's the third appearance. Nice one. Thank you, Erik.
Yeah, thank you, Peter.
Okay, so what did you make of that? Did you enjoy that? Do you want free markets and anarchy for all? So for me, this really... it really did clear up a lot. I've heard all the arguments for an anarchist or even a minarchist society, and I think there are certain areas of society which would really thrive under libertarian ideals, but there are other aspects such as healthcare, animal welfare, pollution that I'm still not 100% convinced about. And I think Erik's great for this because he comes at it from a very pragmatic viewpoint, and I really like the goal of just reducing government for now. Instead of growing year on year, giving more power, more money to the government, I like the idea of trying to shrink this, and maybe Bitcoin can replace parts of the financial system. Maybe Bitcoin is the tool to facilitate this. So yes, this chat really helped me. Erik definitely cleared some things up for me, and if you haven't heard the other shows I've done recently with Saif Dean, Amusa and Stefan Nevers on Austrian economics and libertarianism, I do recommend you give them a listen. They definitely tee this one up. And if you've got any more questions about this, you want me to do more shows like this, do reach out to me. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com. Also, massive thanks to everyone who supports the show. If you like the show, if you listen to it every week and you want to do something, it doesn't matter what you do, whether you just listen to the sponsors or you leave me a review on iTunes, click on the subscribe button. All those things really help. But if you want to find out more, head over to my website. It's whatbitcoindid.com. Click on the support section. That will explain everything to you. Right, it's actually really early here. It's like 4 a.m. and I'm in Palm Springs. I want to go back to bed. So, yeah, hope you enjoyed the show. If you've got any questions, do reach out to me. My email address is hello@whatbitcoindid.com.